Hello and welcome to Heroic Wanderings. My name is Tamara, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of my story so that you know what my context is, where I come from. You may relate to parts of it or all of it, but I hope that wherever you feel a resonance with your own story, you can feel affirmed that you are not alone on your own wandering journey. So, I am a Canadian prairie girl. I grew up in the province of Saskatchewan first until about the age 13 and then Manitoba. So, for much of my life, I have lived on the Canadian prairies, which is much like the American Midwest. I grew up in a church family. My family background was Mennonite. My grandparents on both sides of the family were refugees who came over from Russia at the time of the Russian Revolution, and they escaped a lot of turmoil and brought with them a lot of trauma. They settled on the Canadian prairies and in parts of the US as well, mostly as farmers living in their little communities, keeping pretty much to themselves for the first part. My father was a pastor, and so church and religious life was what we lived and breathed in all of the years that I was growing up. And so in the early years, what I learned at home was a lot about Anabaptist values, which is where Mennonites came out of, which was the idea that social justice was extremely important, that you take seriously the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, to love your enemies, to serve others, to alleviate suffering, to live simply and with humble values. Those are all parts of my Mennonite background that I cherished and still cherish. There was also an understanding that everyone had a right to read and interpret the Bible and scriptures for themselves. And so there was much in my upbringing that was affirming. My parents were gentle and loving people, very generous and hospitable to others. Very, very dedicated to their work. At the age of 13, we moved to Manitoba. We moved to the Bible Belt in Manitoba. And that was a tremendous culture shock for me, because here I found that Mennonite meant something very different than what I had grown up with. There was very much a black and white sense of right and wrong and judgment and who was a sinner and who was saved and who wasn't saved. There was a huge preoccupation with the end times and the book of Revelation. There was just a lot of fear and judgment. And having learned in my later life that I am quite a sensitive empath, there was a lot of fear and judgment just in the environment around me that I could feel and that I soaked up and didn't have language for and didn't know how to deal with, and everything in me just completely reacted against it. A lot of things that from a very young age had not made sense to me, like the concept of hell as a place of eternal punishment, like the idea of being given free will and then being punished for using our free will, like the idea that we're born in sin and fallen people. When I looked at a beautiful, innocent baby, that just didn't make sense to me. So there was a lot that in my own head, just from a very young age, I had filed away. I had also had a very keen interest in everything that was beyond. As someone who now studies astrology, I have learned that I have a great deal of Scorpio in my chart. And so there was from birth a huge orientation toward the occult, toward the metaphysical, toward understanding how the universe works, and just thinking on a very, very large scale. There was no scope for that. And in fact, in the Bible Belt, things became smaller and smaller and more constricting, and everything in me just completely rebelled against it. I learned to not say what I thought, because I realized that as someone, especially as a female with a strong voice, a lot of how I presented myself with my voice made people uncomfortable. So I learned to really hold back my voice and my truth. And as a result, at the age of 18, and on the Sunday when I gave my baptism testimony and sang in a duet with a friend, my voice broke and I completely lost my singing voice. And in the years later on, when I look back at that, it was very poignant and metaphorical for me that as someone who had learned to really hold myself back, I completely choked off my truth and lost my voice. I went on to Bible college where I met my husband, who had grown up in Quebec. He was from also a Mennonite tradition, a different tradition. And if you're one of those people who equates Mennonite with horse and buggies, that is not the tradition that I come from, but that is the tradition that my husband's father came from. And in fact, he was the first in his family to leave that tradition and modernize. And so there is a whole range of what Mennonite means. But at any rate, we got married and moved to Quebec. And that was my second great culture shock, because if anything might be the polar opposite of Canadian Bible Belt, it would be Montreal, Quebec, where people had left the Catholic Church in droves in the 60s and 70s, and it had become an extremely secularized society. And so, once again, there was a huge inner shift as I tried to navigate unfamiliar territory and began to realize how completely sheltered my upbringing had been. And so, after many years in Quebec, when we started a family, we moved back to Manitoba, and I had to readjust to living in the Bible Belt once again and feeling like I was in a tremendous time warp, as in Montreal, our church had been dealing with a lot of social issues, navigating the whole world of sexual and gender identities, and now coming back to a place where that was not even mentioned or talked about. It was extremely difficult to try to squeeze myself back into the Bible Belt box. But the real kicker came when my youngest son was born in 2003, on the heels of the drumbeat towards the Iraq War. After 9/11 had happened and there was an escalation, and the whole march to war with Iraq completely threw me off kilter, because I could see that there was no reason for this to be happening. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and what was going on here, that the world was allowing this country to be attacked and with no justifiable reason behind it. It was bewildering and it was shocking, and my heart for humanity was just overflowing with pain because of it. And on the day that my son was born, he was born in early evening, and after my husband had left and gone home, I was alone with my son. And I turned on the TV, and every single channel was showing the invasion of Iraq and the bombing of Baghdad and the pyrotechnics, the flashing lights and the bombs and everything. I couldn't get away from it no matter which channel I turned to. And the one thought that struck me was that I was in Canada, sitting in a safe, quiet, peaceful hotel room of my own, a private room where I could hold my son in peace and welcome him into the world with a safe, loving embrace. And somewhere in that mayhem in Baghdad, there had to be mothers giving birth amidst the bombing and the shattering of glass and the screams of terror. And what were these babies experiencing as they entered human life? It was horrifying to me that we were a world that allowed this kind of thing to happen. And I had such a compulsion to know and understand what was going on. Why did the world let this happen? And from my perspective, as an adherent of Christianity, why hadn't 2,000 years of Christianity made a difference and brought the peace in the world that it was meant to? Jesus came as the Prince of Peace and taught us to love one another and live in peace. And yet here, this was happening. And so in the years that followed, I did a lot of reading. I did a lot of researching, watching documentaries, trying to find out on all different fronts, economic, religious, sociocultural, what was happening. And what I came to understand with all of my reading was that we are a severely unbalanced humanity, particularly because in our foundational beliefs in the religions that many of us around the world have espoused: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, this unbalance of a male only divinity with no feminine principle meant that we are on a completely skewed dynamic where the feminine principle is completely devalued. And I could see the result of that. I myself had grown up in a tradition where women were not allowed to speak behind the pulpit until I was probably in my teens. Women were not allowed to hold positions of leadership. Some of the Mennonite churches in the town where I lived, even in high school, had men and women sitting on opposite sides of the church. And the women, of course, would not be allowed to speak, even to raise questions. And I could see this imbalance in what was happening in the environment, our Mother Earth, that we were not caring for, that we were raping and pillaging for our consumption and for our profit. And there were so many ways in which I could see that we were such a sick and imbalanced society. And I had a lot of despair in those years. I did a lot of writing of poetry, which I hope to sometime put into a volume for publish. I really embraced the story of the Wizard of Oz and Dorothy's struggle to integrate the different parts of herself, her brain, her heart, her courage, to be able to find the way home, the way toward healing and wholeness. To me, it became a very profound metaphor for our heroic journey and how we need to go in search of these different parts of our souls that have splintered off in our road to ego domination and ego gratification. And so it was a lot of years of searching with very little outlet to talk to. And then in 2017, I was diagnosed with cancer, with breast cancer. Which was another seismic shock in my inner landscape. And as I tried to process following all of my treatments and going through a year of cancer recovery, I started, because of course you're looking for the cause. What did I do, or what could I have done differently? And the big realization that I came to was just how disempowered I had become. That I had become someone who allowed others to walk over me, to overstep my boundaries. I did not know how to set boundaries. I did not know how to confront people. I was so sensitive toward everyone else's energy and emotions and dynamics that I could immediately tell when anything made somebody else uncomfortable. And so I was just someone who was trying to pull in to try to make other people uncomfortable. And I had lost my sense of myself. I had no sense of boundaries. I had no ability to assert myself. And so I realized that I had compromised myself by being a people pleaser, by being the good girl in so many ways. I had kept even the wanderings and the searching, for the most part, I had kept in the closet. I had had a few conversations with family members, but again, my desire to never offend or make anyone uncomfortable made it that I kept most of what was going on very close, cards held close to my chest. But going through cancer became the gift that really showed me where I needed to do my work. And I had a lot of work to do to build an inner structure of empowerment and even a sense of self. And so I started learning about tools to come into myself. I had to bring myself back into my body. And so I learned how to use energy tools and how to practice Qigong. I had to work with my overcritical mind that had really turned on the attack. And so I had to learn tools for observing the mind and knowing how to disengage from that unhealthy, critical inner dialogue. And so here I am after a couple of years of intensive work on just building my own empowerment. And now I feel a real compulsion and a real passion for helping others reclaim their power, to understand power, to understand how disempowerment shows up even when we think it looks like power, so that we can start navigating our world on our own terms. So that's a bit of my story. I'm sure other bits and parts of it will come up in subsequent videos. I would love for anyone to share comments about their story if things resonated. If they did not, please leave comments and let's start building a little tribe here for people to come and just know that whatever journey you're on, you are not alone. Thank you.